Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneurs Show, where we celebrate the innovators driving change in the education industry. At Edison OS, we've worked with over 500 knowledge entrepreneurs to turn their edtech ideas into profitable businesses. Hi, David. Welcome to the Knowledge Entrepreneur Show. Thanks so much for taking time out for this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Likewise, David. David, my first question is I happen to read and listen to a couple of your other podcasts, and I've got some questions listed for you here from them. You've shared that, education was a transformative force in your life. Can you talk about the defining moment when you realized just how much important education would be for your future?
Interesting question. So when I first realized it, I think I'm still realizing it. So, I mean, well, I can back up. So when I was in third grade, I was reading unbelievably slowly, so slowly that of my two recesses at school, I had to spend one of them just, in a classroom of slow readers. We were reading into a recording device that read back to us. So terribly embarrassing. And then it was between fourth and fifth grade in the summer that I read the book Hatchet. I absolutely love the book. I fell in love with reading. I read over 50 books that summer. And then the next year, because I had read so much, suddenly school became so much easier for me. And I went from being essentially at the bottom of my class to like second in my class. And I finally found joy through success at school. That then put me on track to start challenging myself more and more and more. I ended up going to a private high school, taking, ancient Greek in high school, doing very well, going to the University of Chicago, and then got into education myself afterwards. But it's really been a process throughout my whole life of seeing just how important education is. Like, for instance, at the University of Chicago, we have a very large core curriculum. It's about 2 years out of the 4 years are just spent taking core courses. And while I was at the University of Chicago, I didn't appreciate all of the work that they were having us do on what I felt were useless topics. Like, why am I reading Hobbes? Why am I reading Rousseau? Why am I reading these ancient philosophers? While there are real world problems and while I should be learning hard skills. And I didn't appreciate it until I'm still appreciating it more and more, just seeing how valuable all education is in different ways. So now when people talk about justice or people talk about a society, now I can actually understand, well, where did those ideas come from? How do we really actually evaluate these things? I'm not looking at things in a vacuum. So I have come to appreciate my education through more and more throughout my entire life, is a long explanation for your short question. So
No, absolutely, David. I don't think it can be, said in any other way. And I understand when you say, every day you realize that. I take it as every day it kind of makes you remember, or it reminds you that, how important it was. And you also mentioned you took up ancient Greek at high school. Do you think classical languages help, you anyway? Do you look back and say, what, that is actually helped me in a certain way?
it's a great question. So it's interesting that a lot of people will say, oh, take Greek or Latin because then you'll learn the roots to words and your vocabulary will be better. That to me is not a good justification for taking Greek and Latin. Like, that's just, 0.001% of what you get from Greek and Latin. If it were just that, no, just study the roots of words. You don't need to take Greek or Latin for that. The reason why I'm so glad that I took Greek is, again, long explanation for a short question. It gives me a much better understanding of human nature and of society in the world. So when COVID hit and there were lockdowns and everyone that could work from home was working from home, I was on a podcast and the podcast host asked me if I thought that this would be a permanent change where people were going to permanently be working from home. And I said no, because I've been reading about people. I've been reading, not just reading about people, I've been reading the writing of people from 2,500 years ago. And people truly have barely changed. I mean, so one, you know, genetically, we're essentially absolutely identical to what we were 2,500 years ago. So there's no change from an evolutionary perspective on that short of a time frame in human beings because our lives are fairly long compared to 2,500 years. And so there's essentially no genetic change, and there's essentially no change to human nature then. So, yes, we'll change culturally and values might change to some degree, but human nature remains the same. And it's a little bit crass, but I think it's a good example. Aristophanes was a Greek playwright who wrote comedies, and he would make jokes about flatulation. Um, we are still making these same jokes today. Like you will still see essentially these same jokes in movies. And so there's a lot more proliferation. If I were to sum up how have we changed in the last 2,500 years, we have a lot more technology, but that hasn't changed humanity that much.
Right.
I would say we have much more access to information. So a lot more people, the average person probably understands the physical workings of the universe better than, maybe Plato. But what we've gained in knowledge, we've lost in wisdom, and we've gained a lot in arrogance. And so reading people from 2,500 years ago has given me a longer time horizon to when people ask the question, hey, are we going to be working from home permanently for the rest of human history? And I say, I just don't think so because I I don't think that Zoom will change human nature so fundamentally that we no longer crave these in-person connections. And then when you look, more in the totality of human beings, how we gain from those human connections, in-person connections. There's more mentorship there. There's more loyalty to companies. There's more exchanging of ideas. We can do a lot with our virtual tools as we are right now, talking across the world. But there's still no replacing some things. And so that understanding of humans has better positioned me to understand humans in today. And we're seeing, 5 years later, that podcast host had said, no, I think this is a permanent change. I said, I don't think it is. And we're seeing people across the world coming back into the office and more in-person mandates. So I would say that's one small example of how learning Greek and Latin can allow you to read not just about people, but read people and see the brilliance and the wisdom that people even 2,000, 2,500 years ago had.
Got it, David. And you know, both of your answers had something to do with reading, which is the biggest, you know, problem that the tutors today or the teachers today see in the current students, actually, which because of which a lot of students are facing a lot of problems with the test prep or, a lot of other things. Reading is basically not a habit anymore like it used to be. But anyway, yeah, it's not a coincidence that, you had to speak about reading for both of the answers, and it makes a lot of sense. And David, you also said that you paid for your own school. You started working when you were pretty young. So, what lessons did that experience teach you that still influence your work today? And what did you work as?
Yes. So it's ironic that I work in test prep now. So this might sound like a made up story. But when I was in eighth grade, I asked my parents to pull the school profiles of the surrounding private schools because my public school was decent, but not that great. And there was just, I had a pull towards education at that point. So I wanted to get the best education I could. And so my parents pulled the profiles of the surrounding schools, and the highest SAT ACT scores, the highest average SAT ACT scores were from a high school Notre Dame and high school Loyola Academy. and Notre Dame was all boys. So I decided I wanted to go to Loyola Academy. And so, my parents took a look at the price tag, and then even, we contacted the school. I, I did very well on their entrance exam, and so as part of that, they gave me a very generous financial aid and merit aid package. But still, it was too much for my parents to pay for. My father was a hospice chaplain at the time. My mom, a teacher's assistant for kids with special needs, and they had two kids in college besides me. So they were like, "I'm sorry, David, we cannot afford this." I was like, "What if I pitch in?" And so they're like, "Hey, if you pay," after all the scholarships, it was going to be $4,000 a year. So they said, and I was 13 years old at the time, they said, "Hey, if you pay $1,000 a year, we'll come up with the other 3,000." I was like, "All right, deal."
Wow.
So,
Okay.
got a job caddying, spent my summers doing that, and I also, any clothes I wanted besides like the bare essentials, that I was paying for that as well. So, um, work was a necessity for me. And I am so unbelievably glad that it was. So, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, which for people that don't know is like just massive company at this point in the tech space, he was giving a talk to Stanford graduates. And he talked about how essentially when you graduate from a top school, you feel very entitled to a good life. And that entitlement leads to low resilience, and resilience is very important for success. So his number one piece of what he wished upon the Stanford graduates, he said, "I hope you experience pain and suffering." Because pain and suffering and other things, it's experience that builds character. Intelligence does not give you resilience. Character gives you resilience. And
Right.
so being forced to work at a young age, I think built up my character, built up my resilience. And I think that gave me a huge advantage over my peers. And it's something that I'm very, very thankful for today. And, I only have one child at this point, but it's something I constantly think about with my own son of how am I going to raise him to not be entitled, because that will be the worst thing for him and for the world. How can I allow him to, have opportunities, but to experience failure, experience pain, and learn that he can overcome them, and that these things are necessary inputs for success. So again, long way of saying, yes, I did work when I was young, and I'm so glad that I did. I think it's good for everyone to have to actually get a job, go through some pain and suffering, and also just learn business and an appreciation for money and finance and how to relate to customers. So very, very thankful for that.
Got it, David. There's that quote, right? Hard times make tough people. And, it's a cycle. And instead of having to experience that naturally, I think it's better to kind of, have kids go through some tough phases so that the big picture is not going to be a suffering or something like that. But yeah, I totally get, where you're coming from. But yeah, the Stanford students, in a way, they would have worked hard to get to Stanford, but that mostly comes from intelligence, probably, and not from, sheer character or, having to work hard or resilience and stuff like that. But yeah, got it. David, coming to the test prep now, the SAT and the ACT have changed significantly over the years.
Yes, and just to piggyback, I love that saying. So if you don't mind, I'll just say the whole thing for the listeners. So it's, I love that you know it as well. So it's hard times lead to strong men. We could also say strong women. Strong men lead to easy times. Easy times lead to weak men. Right. So there's this cycle,
Right, right. That's the
and
thing. Yeah.
right. So, but yes. So to your question about the SAT and ACT and aptitude versus achievement. So the SAT was started in the 1920s as a way to democratize access to the highest levels of education in higher education at the top colleges. So what was happening is at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they all had their own entrance exams. Those entrance exams actually had Greek and Latin on them. And so who was prepared to do that? Well, really only the students from these very select private high schools that were just feeder schools. So basically, if you were wealthy enough to be able to afford one of those private high schools, then you were going to, be in a position to then do well on the entrance exams. And it was really just a conveyor belt of the wealthy
Right.
going to the top private schools to the top colleges. So these college presidents said, hey, how can we make this more fair, right? How can we find these disadvantaged students who have very high potential, who just never had the opportunity to learn Greek and Latin and things like that? So they came up with the SAT, which at the time was basically a IQ test, an aptitude test. So they said, we're just going to, give this to a bunch of students throughout the country, and students who are disadvantaged but have a high IQ, they'll be able to demonstrate that to us, and then they'll be able to come to our otherwise closed off institutions. And it absolutely worked. And it did open the doors to education for disadvantaged students. Now, then in the 1950s, the ACT was started. It was started more as an achievement test, though. So, what did you learn in school? Can you demonstrate that on test day? Over the years, it became less in style to be testing IQ. There are a lot of, and for good reason, you're never going to have any perfect measure. So there was a lot of pushback around the idea of measuring IQ. And so the SAT followed in the ACT's footsteps of becoming more of an achievement test. Now, I will say, even though that's the case, the ACT remains more true to its roots of an achievement test. The SAT still does remain more true to its roots, that it's become much more of an achievement test, but it still retains more of an aptitude tendency, where ACT is, did you learn it? Can you do it on a test day? And can you do it really quickly? SAT is, did you learn it? Can you apply it in a new way that you've never seen before? And get it right, but you have more time per question. So that's generally, that's the genesis and the evolution of those two tests.
Great. Thanks for that, David. David, another common belief that is held is, when they talk about good test takers and bad test takers, especially, from a testing point of view. Do you think that's true, or it's more about preparation and the mindset?
The way you phrased it is perfectly. There is perfect. So yes, it is true, but it is more about preparation and mindset. So, there are some students who are just bad test takers. And, what does a bad test taker mean? It means they really just cannot pull it together under the pressure of a standardized test, no matter what, right? And that is very unfortunate for them because they will never be able to, or potentially never be able to, really demonstrate their acquired knowledge and skill to colleges. But we are talking about a very small percentage of students. For the vast majority of students, they're not bad test takers. They think they're bad test takers, but either they don't know the knowledge and skill, or they haven't actually gone through how to become a quote-unquote good test taker, in the sense that they learn how to keep their cool under the pressure of a test. They learn time management. So, for instance, one big mistake that students make is they try and get all the questions right on test day. Now, you might be like, wait, why is that a mistake? Shouldn't they be trying to get every question right on test day? No, only about 1% of students should be trying to get all the questions right on test day. The other 99% of students should be trying to get the most number of questions right that they can get. And that's a big difference between trying to get everything right. Because when you're trying to maximize the number of questions you get right, when you hit a question that will take you a long time on, if you're trying to get every question right, you're going to get stuck on that question and you're going to burn a lot of time. When you're trying to
Right.
just maximize the number of questions you get right, you're going to strategically say, hey, that question, it's not even worth it. for me to get that question right, because I can get that question right and not get to 2 or 3 questions at the end. So what's the smart thing to do to get the most number of questions right? Immediate educated guess, move on to the next question. And, even students who can do that in practice, a lot of times then they'll get to test day and they'll be like, oh, now I really need to get all the questions right. And it's like, no, you really need to do what you were doing in practice. You never want to switch up the strategy on test day. So for the vast majority of students, they can, and I'm not talking about SAT, ACT test taking. I'm talking about test taking ability, right? So
Right, right.
learning how to get better at the SAT and ACT is learning how to keep your cool under pressure, learning to try and maximize the number of questions you're getting right, not trying to get all the questions right, learning the knowledge and skill. So these are broadly applicable. So yes, there are some students who are just, they really probably will, we're not all perfect at everything. There are some things that I'm just terrible at. And, that's just a personal quirk. So for some students, yes, I actually would say that some are going to be held back by their standardized test scores through no fault of their own. But luckily, standardized test scores are just one part of the overall puzzle. So there are the grades, there are the essays, there are the SAT, ACT scores are one part of the puzzle. So it doesn't necessarily have to hold them back overall. And then hopefully they also do have great teacher recommendations. And those teachers say, hey, this student struggles on tests, but you'll never find a better student in the classroom who does their homework, who applies themselves. So it's one part of the puzzle. But for the vast majority of students, they can improve their scores because they need to learn test taking. They need to learn the fundamental knowledge and skills tested on these exams. They're going to see their scores increase. They're going to see their knowledge and skills increase. They're going to see their success in college increase. Because the SAT and ACT, they're not testing you on random knowledge and skill. They're testing you on the knowledge and skill demonstrated to be most predictive of success in college, because those are the skills most necessary for college.
Got it, David. And when it comes to choosing between the SAT and the ACT, how do you think parents and students should go about it?
So a lot of people will just default to, if they're on the coasts, the SAT, or if they're in the middle of the country, ACT, because that's historically been the norm.
Yeah.
But we really encourage students, no, you have to take a full-length SAT, practice SAT. You have to take a full-length practice ACT. Then compare your scores on both. Now, since the SAT changed last year in March of 2024, the SAT, not only does it give students more time per question, which students prefer, like on the ACT, the average student will not finish the reading and science sections. So they're going to feel dumb because they didn't finish the sections. But they just need to understand, no, on the SAT, you might have gotten tricked and gotten questions wrong. That's no better, no worse than just not quite finishing a section on the ACT. Don't go on the feel of it, go based on your score comparison on both. Now, since the SAT changed, not only does it give students more time per question like it did before, which students prefer the feel of, but now it's adaptive. So all students get the same verbal section, first verbal, hard, medium, and easy questions. Now, if they do well, their next verbal section will be hard and medium questions. If they do not as well, their next verbal section is just medium and easy questions. And then it repeats for math. First math, hard, medium, easy. Second math, it adapts. Hard and medium if you did well, or just medium and easy questions if you didn't do as well. Well, what happens is you basically, if you don't quite do well enough to get into the hard verbal and the hard math, then you're basically capping your score at like a 1200, 1250. Even so, if you get slotted into those easy modules, those secondary easy modules, and you get like everything right, well, your score is still around capped at like 1200, 1250. Well, those students then who get a 1200 roughly or below on the test, they will come out of the SAT taking the SAT and the ACT, and they'll say, oh man, the SAT felt so much easier. And it's like, yes, because it was an easier test. on that second module on the verbal and math, you never got the hard questions.
The hard
You
ones, right?
literally have not seen the hardest SAT questions yet. You truly got an easier test. Whereas on the ACT, it doesn't adapt. So they're going to, again, feel dumb because they're going to get to these really hard ACT questions that they have no idea how to do. And they're going to say, hey, I want to do the SAT because that was so much easier. And it's like, but it's not an accurate comparison because on the SAT, if you're below that 1200, you probably never saw the hard questions. So they have to understand once their score goes over that 1200, 1250 mark, they're going to see the hardest SAT questions. And now the SAT might not feel that much better. So that's a, again, long way of saying take a practice test of each, use the official concordance table to compare your scores on both, and don't really go on the feel, go based on what test, according to the numbers, fit you best.
Got it, David. David, is there a chance that, students who prepare really well for the hard questions in math somehow ignore the easier questions and still not end up getting the hard questions to solve, and they do even, worse in what is going to be your easier paper, where, you say the score is going to be capped at 1200?
So the question is, if you do really well on the hard ones, but you don't
Not
do well,
do. If you're
oh,
preparing very well for the hard ones, assuming, okay, you know what, I'm going to be fine with the easy ones, but, I'm going to be just going to focus more on the hard and medium. But then for whatever reason, you don't do the easier ones as well as it should be done, right? Is there a chance to, falter there?
good question. I would say no. And the reason for that is that the hard questions are not necessarily limited to certain topics. It's really they
Okay,
so like you could take a question on quadratics. Now, on quadratics, you could get an easy question, you could get a medium question, you could get a hard question. The
right.
hard questions typically require you to know multiple
Right,
things about quadratics,
right, right.
whereas the easy ones require you to maybe know one thing. So, an example of that would be an easy question on quadratics could be, can you FOIL, you know, a quadratic? Whereas on a hard, it's can you FOIL it? Then can you get the y-intercept from it? Can you also find the discriminant of it? So it's going to have you do multiple things. So that what I mean by that is if you've studied the hard questions, really what that means is you've done the hardest questions on each topic. Now, once you've done the
Right.
hardest questions on each topic, you're well prepared for any question you could be asked on those topics. So it really means find out what topics you're missing, target those topics, and you'll be good for the easy, medium, or hard questions on those topics.
Got it, David. David, in your experience, what do you think are the most common preparatory mistakes that students should avoid while preparing for the test?
I think the biggest one is underestimating just how difficult it is to get a very large increase. Now, if it were easy, everyone would do it. Now, what would happen if everyone did it? Well, then colleges would just set a higher bar and a higher expectation.
Right. Right.
So we know that not everyone is doing it, and so we should know then that it must not be easy. Because if it was easy, everyone would do it. And we can almost be happy in a way that it's not easy. Because again, if it was easy, everyone would do it and it would just become harder again, right? There'd be a new higher bar. So it is hard, and we can get an advantage from hard work then. So it is hard work, but let's not underestimate how much hard work it is. Now, why is it so much hard work? Because we need to get better at reading. We need to get better at grammar. We need to get better at rhetorical skills. And rhetorical skills are really an undervalued skill. Rhetorical skills are, can you construct a paragraph in a way that's going to be convincing? Can you construct a sentence in a way that's going to be clear and convincing? These are not skills that a lot of high schools have intentionally taught. They're very helpful for college and for life, but they haven't necessarily been intentionally taught those things. And then, on the SAT, there's over 100 math topics that you're going to be tested on. So there's a lot of content and skills to develop, and you're competing against real people, right? So you're competing against everyone else that's taking these tests. So it's really hard to outcompete most people on any knowledge or skill. So you can do it, but it takes a lot of hard work. So that's the number one thing. Don't go in underestimating the amount of hard work. I would also say keep taking the real tests. So the vast majority of colleges use the Common App. And in the Common App, you're only self-reporting your highest verbal score and your highest math score across any tests. So you could take the test 5 times, and let's say you get a 750 on one of the verbals. That's all they see for the verbal, is that 750
Mm.
verbal. If you got a 550 verbal one time, there's not even a place to put that in to the Common App. You literally couldn't report your
Right.
550. Same
Got
thing
it.
for the math. You're only putting in your highest ever math on any test date that you've taken. What the vast majority of schools, we're talking about like 95% of them will do then, they'll take those self-reported scores, evaluate your application. Only if you're accepted and then you enroll will they require you to send your official scores from the testing agencies. So at that point, you might send in 5 test dates. I wouldn't. I mean, I would just send in the 2. I would send in the one that gives your highest verbal, the one that gives your highest math. But at that point, let's say you have a 550 verbal and a 750 math one time, and you have a 750 verbal another time and a 550 math. They don't care that you got that 550 verbal once and that 550 math once.
Right.
They're not going to rescind your acceptance letter at that point. They're just verifying, did this person tell the truth in their application that one time they got a 750 verbal, one time they got a 750 math. So as long as you are telling the truth, that's your highest ever verbal, highest ever math, you're good. So what that means is you can take the test as many times as you want with no fear of, oh, I'm going to have to submit all these. Well, for the vast majority of colleges. There's a few exceptions like Georgetown, which we can get into that level of detail if we want. But vast majority of schools, doesn't matter how many times you take it, just keep taking it. You never know when you're going to have a good day with a test that fits your content knowledge well and on a test that has a good curve. So we know that all people can have a good or bad day, right?
Yeah.
It's going to affect our score. And just like we talked about, you could be, maybe you're amazing at exponents, but you're mediocre at quadratics. Well, then that day, maybe it was a easy exponent question that you got and a really hard quadratics question that you got. So you're going to miss that quadratics question, but get the
Right.
exponents one right. But then it could be reversed the next time. And it's a really hard exponents question that you just nail it because that test just lines up with your knowledge and skill better. And the scores are quite accurate. The SAT and ACT scores are quite accurate and representative of a student's acquired knowledge and skill, but they're not perfectly accurate. So there's errors in the curve. So you can absolutely expect to go up 60 points or down 60 points from your real ability level just based on the curve. So when we consider that personal performance, content on that test, and an imperfect scoring process, you could see, it's a little bit less likely, but it does happen, swings of plus or minus 100 points just from that test date. So then it's to your advantage to take the test multiple times. Because
Right.
if you do really well on the verbal one day, boom, you've locked in that great verbal score. Stop working on the verbal, do no more prep for the verbal, just prep for the math. And then, keep taking it. It's going to line up as long as you continue to learn and improve. Eventually you're going to do a lot better at the math, and you lock in the math and then you're done. And I've now forgotten what your original question was. What's your original question on it?
It was what are the common mistakes students should avoid while preparing? And I think you started off by saying that you shouldn't underestimate the how difficult it is to have the jump.
Exactly. So
And
first,
yes,
yes, perfect. So first, don't underestimate it. Second would be to understand that you can take the test multiple times. And then the third would be don't take breaks if you can avoid it. So,
Right.
I mean, our brains, the best analogy that I have for our brains and knowledge and skill is that our brains are cups with holes at the bottom. So you're pouring in knowledge and skill, but as you're pouring in knowledge and skill, that knowledge and skill is draining out as well, which is obvious to anyone who thinks about it. That's why when you take AP US history, you might study for the AP exam. If they gave you that AP exam a year later, how would you do on it? Not well, because a lot of that knowledge would have,
Right.
over time, drained out. So how do you actually get better at something and thus increase your score on it? Well, you have to be pouring knowledge and skill in faster than it's draining out. Well, every time you take a break, you have knowledge and skill draining out without it being poured in. So you need to pour it in faster. So breaks can also be detrimental. And then last thing would just be, when you're dedicated to whatever process you're doing, whether it's online, an online platform or a class or tutoring, work hard at it and pick a good provider.
Got it, David. And when you say breaks, you're talking about breaks while preparing, right?
Good clarification. So yes, what a lot of students will do is, they might those students who are really on it, um, they might take the September ACT in the beginning of their junior year, which ACT scores you can even delete for free at any time. So you can really, really go in and take the real test, even just as practice, because what's the best practice? The real thing is the best practice for the real thing. And so
Yeah.
because you can delete ACT scores for free at any time, there's not even a record of that you took the test if it's deleted. It's just a simple email to the ACT organization. Um, because you can do that, you can take the test early. Well, what a lot of students will do who are really on it is they'll take the September ACT, then they'll wait the 2.5 weeks for the results. And then if they don't like their score, they'll resume. Well, then before the
That's
October
a
test,
break.
that's a break,
Right.
and then they might prep for the next 4 weeks, take the October test, wait the 2.5 weeks, get those
Mm.
results, then resume for the next 4 weeks. Well, when you play that out over months, students are missing about 1/3 of the prep relative to those kids who don't take a break. Well, if you miss 1/3 of your prep, you're probably going to do, 1/3 worse, which is what we see when we actually look at the data behind it. So those kids who just say, hey, I'm starting at this score, I'm just going to keep taking this test, keep doing prep until I hit my score goal, those are the kids who are most successful in the end and most successful most quickly.
Got it, David. A lot of strategies packed in. My next question was about specifically about strategies. Are there anything left, or should we move on to the next one? So I'll just tell you what my next question was.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So just want to know. I already see that you're a big strategy guy, and I was going to ask, what's your take on it? And are there specific approaches that consistently help students improve their scores? I think you've answered that already. If there's anything that you want to fill, go for it.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add that students should definitely be taking full length practice tests. So,
Right.
again, I'm not going to say it's SAT, ACT ability that we're pulling up. We're pulling up our test taking stamina and really academic focused stamina. So if you are told by a coach, "Hey, run a mile," and you haven't run a mile, it's gonna be really hard. Now, once you practice running a mile, well, that gets easier and easier because you're building up your stamina. It's the same thing with our brains. So, if we're used to TikTok videos, it's going to be really hard to focus for a long time, right? So, you really have to build up your test taking stamina where you retain the ability to perform at a high level and focus at a high level for hours at a time. And that takes practice.
Got it, David. David, you spoke about the SAT after it went digital, how the scoring became, oh, sorry, how the test became adaptive. And we did speak about some of the stuff, but I mean, how things are in the test. But from a preparation point of view, has anything changed? as to how it was before SAT going digital and SAT going digital specifically because of the adaptive format?
Fantastic question. It has, I would say, unfortunately, changed a lot. And I say unfortunately because, well, maybe because I provide test prep, so there's a lot that we needed to redo. The math content is largely the same, but the big difference is that now all students have access to an on-screen calculator called Desmos.
Right.
The Desmos calculator is unbelievably powerful, and most students are unfamiliar with Desmos and certainly unfamiliar with just how much of a massive advantage they can have if they really understand how to use that calculator. So that's the biggest thing, is that we've had to now, I mean, now we do full, I mean, most of our students do at least a full hour of private tutoring just on Desmos. And a lot of
Right.
them will do multiple hours just on the Desmos calculator. So that's how impactful it is. So that's a change that it's good in the sense that now all students who didn't have a graphing calculator, because graphing calculators are expensive, they're over $100. That was unfair to them, that some students were walking in with a graphing calculator and some students, didn't have a calculator. Well, now all students have access to essentially the same powerful calculator. Well, they do all have access to that calculator. The disparity now is, do you know really how to use it very well? Right?
Right.
Can you utilize its full capabilities? And that's quite a learning curve for some students. So that's on the math side, but the content's mostly the same. The verbal has dramatically changed. So instead of it being long passages and being 10 to 11 questions on those passages, now it's just shorter passages and one question per passage. And I would say that the question difficulty at the high end has become, the questions are, I don't know, the first word comes to mind is deliciously complex. Like, I love the complexity. They are a mental workout where it's almost like LSAT questions at the high end, where you really have to figure out, inferences and logic. And it's just like next level beyond what the old SAT tested and what the ACT currently tests. Now, that is a lot harder to teach because the level of skill required for those very high level verbal questions is a lot harder. Um, Vocabulary has also made somewhat of a comeback. So students with lower vocabularies, they basically just need to hit the word lists again. And there's some other just different question types that are pretty new, like just straight up testing students on multiple transition words, like the usage of transition words on every single test, or being able to take bullet point notes and integrate them to come up with an answer that completes a task based on those bullet point notes. So that's truly new questions, some of which have never existed on any standardized test before. It's harder to prep students for the verbal section than it was before because those questions are less straightforward. That would be a pro in favor of the ACT at this point, that it's still a little bit more straightforward.
Got it. So the shortening of the comprehension passages haven't really helped in a way students might have expected. It's only gotten more complex, is what you're saying.
Yes. So if students were expecting it to be easier because the passages are shorter, they will be in for a rude awakening. I have never, I've taken a lot of standardized tests, and I have never had to read as closely on any standardized test as I have to read on
Right.
these verbal passages. And I love it because it's like really fun, but with the stakes of trying to get into college, I don't think I would find it fun if I was a student at this point. But those verbal questions are impressively complex.
Got it, David. Uh, David, coming to the test optional movement, it has changed the admissions landscape quite a bit bit of back and forth. Colleges went test optional. Now they seem to be reversing their test optional policies and requiring, and returning requiring the standardized test. What's your take on it? What's happening? Why is it happening?
So in 2024, there was research put out by this group, Opportunity Insights, from professors from both Dartmouth and Harvard, that did really they looked at all of the data from the Ivy and Ivy Plus colleges, so the top colleges in the country. And what they found is that a student's high school grades barely predicted a student's success. It only was about only about 5% of a student's success was predicted by the student's high school grades. In comparison, a student's success, 19.3% of a student's success was predicted by the student's SAT and ACT scores alone. Then when you add in SAT, ACT scores plus grades, that predictive capacity went from 19.3% to 19.6%. So you only gain an additional 0.3% of predictive capacity by adding in high school grades. So really, you gain almost nothing. So these top colleges could really do essentially the exact same job of predicting success without a student's high school grades and just going based on SAT and ACT scores. And
Right.
that might be confusing for families, because it's like, well, how does a 2-hour or 3-hour exam better, not just better predict, but dramatically better predict a student's success in college? And really, it's 3.9 times a better predictor, from 5% to 19.3%. So how is that possible? Well, there's a couple different things going on. One is grade inflation. So according to UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute, they've been putting out a freshman survey that they send to colleges, and then the students at those colleges do this survey. They usually have about 20,000 respondents per year. So it's a very large, robust survey. So they started that in 1966. In 1966, it was about 20% of students at four-year BA granting universities had an A average in high school. So an A average in high school was relatively rare. All right, only 20%. Now, the latest data that we have is from 2023, from this freshman survey. In 2023, it was over 80% of students
Wow.
going on
Okay.
to a four-year BA granting university had an A average in high school. So it went from 20% having an A average to now less than 20% not having an A average.
Right.
Now, there's no problem with that if, that delta of 60%, those kids just are, learned so much more and they're so much better at reading and math. And that would be great. But that's not what has happened. And in fact, the opposite has happened. There's the NAEP scores. That's dubbed the nation's report card. They have longitudinal studies where they study the academic preparedness of fourth and eighth graders. And they do this study every year. According to the NAEP scores, so the standardized assessments of academic achievement in reading and in math for fourth and eighth graders, in the United States, we're at 30-year lows. So this is the worst that, on average, that our nation has been at reading and math in 30 years. ACT scores also, have seen the same trend, especially since COVID. Academic achievement just dropped off a cliff, and we have not recovered. So it's not that students are just so much better prepared for college that their grades are so much higher. No, it shows that those grades are not they're not telling the same story of academic achievement that they used to be telling. And college admissions officers know this, and they'll say this, right? So Christoph Gutentag, he's the Dean of Admissions for Duke. He has said, we don't look at grades from high school A and high school B and assume that those grades tell us anything about the applicant
Right.
when we're comparing two schools. Because those students getting those grades at different schools, they're getting those grades taking different classes from different teachers who grade differently,
Right.
and often on different grading scales. So some students are graded on 4.0, some on 10.0. It's all over the place. And so you really cannot compare. You can't look at two students, look at their GPA, and know which one is better prepared. because of grade inflation and because grades are subjective, they're not standardized across the board. So that's why colleges, especially the top colleges, are saying really. And the other thing that's happening is at top colleges is there's unbelievable, because of grade inflation, there's grade compression at the high end. So a lot of colleges will unweight a student's GPA. So on an unweighted 4.0 scale, the maximum you can get is a 4.0, right? UCLA, which is test blind, test free, that's what they call themselves. In 2023, the last year we have their admissions, that they've published their admission statistics, the median unweighted GPA of their admitted student was a 4.0 out of 4.0. So their average student has a perfect GPA. And
Right.
75% of their admitted students had a 3.95 to 4.0 out of 4.0. So 75% of their students had either a perfect GPA or a almost like just about a perfect GPA. So how do you differentiate between students who have all perfect GPAs? You really can't. So
Right.
that's why UCLA and UC Berkeley that call themselves test blind, they're actually just SAT, ACT blind. They use AP and IB exam scores in their college admissions and process
Right.
instead. And, UC Berkeley on their admissions website, they say they use AP exam scores. UCLA doesn't say that. But then when you listen to podcasts where their deans of admission are interviewed, they say, yeah, we use AP and IB exam scores, or for students from the UK, we use their A-level exam scores. They're not test blind, not test free. They're SAT, ACT blind, SAT, ACT free. If your school offers AP and IB classes, you need to, then essentially their AP, IB exam score required, basically, if
Right.
you had the opportunity to take those classes. So, we see from UCLA, there's unbelievable grade compression. We see from the Higher Education Research Institute, there's unbelievable grade inflation. We see that there's been a drop-off in actual academic achievement. We see from admissions officers that they're saying that grades are not really connected to true class performance. Actually, just another one would be John Ladding. He's the dean of admissions at Emory University. He said in 2023 in an article for Inside Higher Ed, he said, "We're not as trusting, frankly, of GPA these days. Students are trying their best, but grades are disconnected from academic achievement. Emory will be weighing external assessments more heavily than GPA, particularly AP exam scores." Now, I just want to unpack how mind-blowing that is. That's the first time a dean of admissions, I think ever, has said that they're weighing external assessments, meaning standardized test scores, more heavily than GPA. Not only that, they highlighted AP exam scores, not SAT and
Right.
ACT scores. AP exam scores were always only used for college course credit. Now they're being used, not only are SAT and ACT scores being used, again, coming back into vogue and being used more in college admissions, but even AP exam scores are being used for college admissions. What's more surprising is that Emory is test optional. So this is a test optional college telling you that test scores are more important than a student's high school grades for admission. Test optional, but test scores are more important. And, just as an aside, I know this is a long answer, but, there are more top colleges, the highly selective top colleges are now expecting that if you have an AP class on your transcript, you're submitting a corresponding AP exam score for that class. Yale has literally said that they expect to see, for every AP class, an AP exam score. So that's new. So that's all to say, schools, if they want to value academic achievement, they really have to value standardized test scores in some form or fashion, whether it's SAT, ACT scores, or not as accurate, not as good, less accessible AP and IB exam scores. That's why testing is coming back into college admissions.
Got it, David. Um, I mean, just a slight digression from here. Given that there's the public acknowledgement that, school GPAs are not the deciding criteria. Have you come across any schools focusing solely on test prep for students, and anything that's not related to test prep just probably takes a backseat? Isn't that going to be beneficial?
You mean so college is focusing on that?
The schools,
Well, like high school is focusing on it, or
yeah,
high schools.
test prep, yeah, yeah. Instead of the usual academic stuff, you know, make test prep the primary goal, so that the students are anyway benefited, so that it helps them with the college admissions as well. Why do you have to, separately prepare? It's just a thought,
Yeah,
not expecting anything concrete or something, but I wonder why not schools do this, so that they can cut out a lot of things that's probably not needed for the test prep, and just straight away start it. Because in India, uh,
hmm,
there is something called as IIT, which are the main exams for, like, a million people take it for how many seats? For a few thousand seats, right?
wow,
Uh, yeah, and there are schools that do not focus a lot on the academic curriculum. They start training these kids from as young as 12, 13 years, because they'd eventually be taking this when they're 18. So it's a 5-year prep time they give themselves. And there are some students who take a year break if they are not able to achieve it further, to give it another try. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, so we've talked about how, or alluded to at least, that the SAT and ACT are testing students on fundamental knowledge and skill. So I think
Right.
that's you know, absolutely what they should be doing, because they can't assess students on history because not everyone has taken this, taken history, like the same history class. They can't test you on high level physics because not everyone has taken an AP physics class. So it
Right.
has to be limited to the fundamental knowledge and skills that we could reasonably assume that most students will have had access to or should have had access to, because we know that this knowledge and skill will be important for college. And so I would say, in the sense that schools should focus more on test prep, I would say I would hope that schools would focus more on building up those fundamental knowledge and skills. You know, I don't want to. I wouldn't. I would absolutely. As someone who believes that all education is meaningful, I would hope that they would not um, cut out um, other subjects, because I mean, physics helps you understand the world around you. Biology helps you understand the world around you. History, we can't understand the present unless we understand the past. We can't predict the future unless we understand the past. So I would really hope that they don't cut out any, useful subjects. And I think the vast majority of subjects are useful. Um, for living just an examined life, beyond the
No,
pure utility of knowledge.
I'm totally with you on that, David. I'm
Yeah.
just saying, probably they need to prioritize this, and probably, give students a choice if they want to. It's not that it's not going anywhere, but, students who are going to be informed enough are going to anyway take that, the other subjects that may not look important for the test prep alone, but it's equally important. Like reading, for example, the kind of impact it's made for you and for so many other people. And I don't think there is a reading session in schools separately today, are they? Like,
Yeah, and I guess um I'm agreeing with you because there are trade-offs. And so if you need to do trade-offs, should you be, I don't know, like I loved my AP psychology class. But if a student is
right.
lacking in the fundamentals of reading and rhetorical skills and grammar, and we had to do a trade-off, which we all have finite time and resources, then yeah, the trade-off would be
Yeah.
better spent
Yeah.
on the fundamentals, because they're going to be better positioned to understand what they read in that AP psychology class if they're better at the fundamentals. The more reading you do, you're going to read faster and understand more of what you read. The stunning reality is that the average high schooler is only understanding about 50% of what they're reading. And I see this on a near daily basis when I'm working one-on-one with students, that I'll have a student, some of the questions are, hey, what's the main idea of this paragraph? So I'll have the student either read the paragraph, or I'll read it, or we'll read it together out loud. And I'll say, hey, at the end of it, so how, in your own words, would you, say what's the main idea of this paragraph? Half the time they get totally wrong. I mean, totally wrong. They totally
Right.
missed the main idea. It's like, what were you reading, right? And I don't blame the student, of course. There are no bad students. Well, there's some exceptions to every rule, but there's no bad students. There's only bad teachers, right? And I'm not blaming teachers. I'm just simply saying, when
If
this,
somebody has to take the responsibilities, might as well be teachers than the students.
yes, I would put it on the educational system, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so again, the NAEP scores show there's a drop in reading and math achievement. So yes, we should absolutely be focusing more on the fundamentals, because the fundamentals set you up for success in all the specific subjects. And to your point, as you've talked about and made the connections between even my answers in a way that I didn't see before, I think the focus above all should be reading, because it impacts every single other academic subject. When you become a better reader, you understand more of what you read, and you read faster, which allows you to get through more material. It's important for every subject, including math. There are some students who will miss math questions because in the word problems, they don't understand what the word problem is
Right.
asking. So I would say absolutely double down, quadruple down on the fundamentals. And from there, I would hope that, students take their knowledge beyond that and also learn in the various subject areas.
Got it, David. And David, that brings us to the end of, can I say part one? Can we do a part two? Because it's literally only half done at this point and we had set aside an hour.
I mean, I would love to do a part two. So
Great. So thanks so much, David, for the part one. And let's probably, decide when we're going to do the part two shortly. Thank you,
fantastic.
David. It was a pleasure.
My
Yeah.
pleasure.